it's like saying Washington, everything that's important has already been said, but it hasn't been said by everybody. But I'm not going to repeat what you've already, except for the thanks, which is to thank Chairman Bustani for leading us today, and Miriam, who it wasn't said but had great experience in the Speaker's office advising on energy, and Lorraine, who's doing agriculture now but knows energy well from her background as well. So a privilege to be here, and thanks to Ken and to the pork producers. I'm actually quite a big barbecue fan, so I appreciate the pork producers. Let me say a word about kind of the big picture, what's going on here. The administration believes that the power of the U.S. market is so large that we can essentially force other countries to take a less advantageous position with the threat of walking away from the trade agreement. This is true with Korea, it's true with NAFTA, is that they can't resist, so we have enormous leverage. And I think this is fundamentally misguided in a globalized world. But what's really going on, I think the fundamental confusion in the administration's policy is that their trade policy is a dagger aimed at the heart of energy dominance. And that is because in the US, gasoline demand is going to be pretty flat. Electricity demand is relatively flat. The future of our oil production, of our gas production, of our production of turbines, of solar panels, of software, of technology, is in exports, and so our growth is going to be going out of the country, and we will not be able to grow our export markets by kneecapping our primary trading partners and undermining their economies, because they will have less money to buy. And something like 60 or 70% of our trade with Canada and with Mexico is recycled into the trade relationship, and so I think this is the fundamental misunderstanding. So I want to talk a little bit about, what can be gained if we don't hurt NAFTA or if we modernize it, and what can be lost, particularly on the geopolitical front. In terms of what can be gained, we start from the position, we've heard some of this already, that we export, we import oil from Mexico, heavy oil from Canada, because we don't produce heavy oil. It is the lowest cost oil that we can buy anywhere. And we use that in our heavy oil refineries, and then we export gasoline. So we buy cheap and we sell high. So that's what Secretary Ross has called blameless trade. But we want to keep that trade going. With natural gas, we have a 2-to-1 surplus with Mexico. But the way our economy works, we trade back and forth, and that provides us with low-cost electricity. It provides us with resilience in the energy system, as we found after Superstorm Sandy. So, and we also have a world where appliances are now coming with sensors, and we have this Internet of Things, and the future of pretty much all manufacturing is going to be in smart appliances. These are things that we make that we want other people to buy. So the idea behind modernizing NAFTA is, first, we would incorporate digital trade, and we would cover a lot of things which weren't addressed by NAFTA, which would enable us to export renewable technologies as well. The other thing to be gained, as has been talked about, is that Mexico took a number of exceptions in NAFTA, essentially to say that it was allowed to protect its energy sector. The energy reforms, which have been fantastic, have removed those restrictions, but having energy addressed in NAFTA would give treaty-level protection to those reforms and lock them in against a potential future Mexican administration that might want to change them. And in fact, a lot of the US investment in the upstream and the deep water in Mexico was incentivized, was assured by the fact that if there was a dispute, that the international arbitration provisions of NAFTA would apply. It was frankly a pretty close call for the US industry, maybe not for others. And so what would be gained is to have that incorporated in the treaty and to lock that in. And the other thing to be gained by this, I think, is to protect the other kinds of industries of the future. What can be lost by this? First, if you lose the investor-state dispute resolution, it is not a certainty that U.S. companies will feel the comfort they need to be able to invest in the Mexican deep water. And I think, as you heard from Jack Gerard earlier, we have seen in Venezuela, we've seen in Brazil, we're seeing in Northern Iraq, that both Russian and Chinese companies are happy to invest in places where the U.S. does not go. And that gives them intelligence access. It also gives them a point of a friction, perhaps, with the kind of safety and other standards that we want to impose. So restricting the U.S. from investing in our neighbor, I think, would be disadvantageous. The other thing that I think could be lost, which would be significant, is on our competitiveness. So a lot of the fight the administration has in trade is over steel. They think that we get a lot of steel that slips in under NAFTA, which is made in other places. But when it comes to pipelines, we don't actually in the U.S. make the kind of steel that you use to make pipelines. This comes from other countries. So if energy dominance is about building out more pipelines and enabling energy to flow freely, raising the cost of steel makes the U.S. less competitive to transporting its own energy. It makes LNG export platforms more expensive because the steel is more expensive. And so I think that's a disadvantage as well. I think the geopolitical piece, I think, is perhaps the saddest part of this whole enterprise, because since the nationalization of the Mexican oil industry, the U.S. and Mexico have had a pretty fractious relationship over time. And the older generation had a great deal of distrust for the U.S. They thought that we were after their oil. They thought that we were interfering in their politics for our own advantages. And it took really decades to change that relationship. And up until the recent election, we had really changed that. And we had cooperated with Mexico on narcotics. We had cooperated on crime. We had cooperated on safety in the Gulf. And we had cooperated on immigration. You may remember the large flows from El Salvador and Guatemala, these sort of child refugees, which were coming over the border, and we worked with Mexico to deal with immigration at Mexico's border. So we built this relationship of trust, and we had an enormous amount of cooperation and regulation in other areas. And the new generation of Mexicans grew up seeing the United States as someone who had shared interests with that country. That prosperity in North America meant that you would have less pressure for migration to the U.S. Shared prosperity meant that as our neighbors prospered, we would trade more. And we had this kind of seamless exchange of goods and services. And now, the rhetoric which has come out of the administration has made every misguided belief about U.S. intentions in Mexico come true. Because now the policy is overtly saying that the U.S. intention is America first. It's a zero-sum game. We want more, you get less. Take it or leave it. And so we are wrecking what took us decades to create, is this relationship of cooperation and trust. And so I think that's really, in a sense, what's at stake in NAFTA, is we can either have this shared vision, which will let the U.S. export to its neighbors, import what we don't have, either that's heavy oil or electricity in the north, or hydropower from Canada to help us meet our renewable targets. So we can either have that vision and grow that pie as we have, which will enable us to cooperate on things like migration and crime and other issues. Or we can have this 1920s version that we're going to put up the wall, take it or leave it, that you're going to buy our stuff, but we're not going to let you, we're not going to take from you. You have to take less, and we're going to get more. And in this world, Mexico has other choices. When it comes to renewable energy, they can buy from Europe. They have a trade agreement with the European Union and with other countries. They don't have to buy our solar panels. They don't have to buy our windmills. They don't have to buy our software. They don't have to buy our smart grid. They're right next door. And Mexico is investing billions now in building out its pipeline system, its power system. It is modernizing the economy in a way that will make Mexico an enormous manufacturing center. So they're either going to use American energy and American goods to build that out, or if we force them to, they will go elsewhere. And we've seen signals of that. In agriculture, saying, your corn is right next door, but we can buy it from somebody else if you're really going to be nasty to us. The U.S. is not the only corn producer in the world. We're not the only gas producer in the world. We're not the only product seller in the world. And if we think that Mexico will basically sacrifice its national pride and sovereignty in order to accommodate the U.S. rather than pay a little bit more, then we haven't looked back in the last 10, much less 100 years of history in Mexico or any other country. So this is really what's at stake now, and I think I'm glad that we've got such strong representation from the Congress here, because it seems that while the State Department might understand this and the Energy Department might understand this, and I think Secretary Ross understands this, it's not so clear that it's the President's vision or the U.S. Trade Representative's vision of the way trade works or the way these relationships ought to work. So it's really going to fall to the Congress, which has to approve any new trade agreement that comes along. which can conduct oversight hearings, and which can either grant or deny the administration the extension of trade promotion authority next summer when it expires. So I don't put a lot of hope in a new vision on the part of the administration, but I guess my question would be maybe back to our panel, is there any hope that Congress can step in? And I think that's where it falls to all of you in the audience to make your voices heard. But we not only have energy dominance at stake because we don't have the Mexican gas market. That's pretty much a death knell for the U.S. gas industry. If we undermine ourselves in the product market, that's going to be pretty bad for the refining industry. But we're also talking about our neighbors and about security. And so I'm hoping that if we can't get that kind of vision out of the administration, that maybe we can get that out of Congress.
Thank you, David. Very compelling points. I want to start, we're going to go back to the geopolitical side because I think it's really important, but I want to start off, Miriam and Lorraine, with both of you representing companies, and you spoke of regulatory coherence, some sort of level of harmony, licensing complications. In my time in Congress, I mentioned this to Jack, I had to deal with companies in Louisiana, for instance, in Texas, who had complications in building cross-border pipelines. I'd like both of you to comment further on those two issues, because to me it highlights the importance of an energy chapter, because that's where those kinds of things could be best addressed by raising the level, as Sergio mentioned in the previous panel, and having it in that energy chapter. It highlights it and it elevates its importance. So I'd love for both of you to elaborate a little further on some of the issues related to licensing problems and the lack of regulatory coherence that your companies face, because both companies have a very big footprint. This mic there.
Sempra has a lot of cross-border interests between the United States and Mexico, both transmission and natural gas. And we see the opportunity for more integration. I think that we've got a lot at the northern border with Canada, and there is some at the Mexican border, but that there's an opportunity for more. I think that there's a lot of desire for there to be more certainty on what that process will be like country to country in approving these projects, be they natural gas pipeline, transmission, or oil. I think one very elegant way to be able to provide that certainty about how countries will review these proposals is in an energy chapter. Another way would be in the regulatory chapter. But it's definitely an opportunity if you're looking for increased North American integration to build on what we've been doing the last 24 years and make it even stronger. That should be at the top of the list in NAFTA modernization.
Thank you.
I fully agree with the notion of stability and what an energy chapter can do to ensure that we as global or multinational companies understand the rules and that we have a stable set of rules for energy trade. We right now have a huge opportunity as Mexico is going through their energy reform process with relationship to renewable fuels, and particularly around ethanol if Mexico continues to open their market. And so both countries would benefit from having a stable set of rules to manage that trade relationship. I think, Mexico is going to benefit, their consumers are going to benefit if they continue to open up. And U.S. citizens will also benefit as well if there is strong cross-border trade. And not to mention, the benefits that will be derived for the agricultural sector for corn ethanol producers as well as Mexican sugar ethanol producers who stand to, have an opportunity here. But we need a level set of rules, transparency, and predictability. That's all very important. I think with respect to Canada, I mentioned we already have a very strong trade in biodiesel, but again, having that codified and having that regulatory coherence exist in the context of NAFTA just underscores, the importance of that trade relationship. So I think, it would be difficult to address these objectives more fully without having an energy chapter in NAFTA. So we're very supportive of the energy chapter and believe that, you know, it's just the right way to go.
Can I have one more?
Yeah, by all means.
One more point that I wanted to raise, and you would be so familiar with this from the work that was done in the last several years for increasing LNG exports, like Cameron, like Cheniere. With respect to natural gas infrastructure, under our laws, under the U.S. laws, and this just goes to the point on certainty, there is a presumption in support of cross-border energy infrastructure and export of energy if there is a free trade agreement that the U.S. has with that other country. And I think it's a question, if we were to lose NAFTA, because that is something that is in the dialogue and in the atmosphere, what that would do to existing infrastructure, the permits for infrastructure with Mexico, because we would no longer have a free trade agreement, and then the going forward for new infrastructure.
I think that's a really important point, because it then calls into question whether this is in the national interest. And I know the Natural Gas Act, that goes way back to the 30s
1941.
or 41, right, had a specification that exports of energy, gas in particular, could be done under circumstances where we had a free trade agreement in place, or if it was defined to be in the national interest, which is somewhat arbitrary.
Right.
And so it creates less certainty
Right.
going forward, and that reverberates through all these other issues, whether it's regulatory harmony and licensing agreements and so forth. So I think it would be very detrimental. I think David pointed out how much of what the administration's proposing right now in trade policy really runs counter to their ultimate goals of what they're trying to achieve. And I think you really summarized in a very short period of time the geopolitical consequences and the stakes that are at place here. I kind of look at NAFTA as a key component in a broader Latin American strategy, and U.S. has clearly neglected Latin America going back to probably FDR's time, when Cordell Hull was Secretary of State, when there was a real attention paid for security reasons back then. And I think if you go back and look at U.S. policy with regard to Latin America and our hemisphere at large, I mean, it's always been sort of the basis has been the Monroe Doctrine. But that's had multiple iterations depending on the times. In my mind, NAFTA is a key component of an economic Monroe Doctrine to ensure that there's fair and open trade, open competition, a level platform for competition. And it seems to me that if we walk away from NAFTA, we're walking away from our position to be competitive there, but we're walking away from a broad strategic imperative that has existed going all the way back to the founding of this country. Dave?
No, I think that's a fair point, and I think the Republican and Democratic administrations really for the last years have moved to a position of shared prosperity. And the idea is that if the development of the hemisphere promotes trade, they buy more from us, but they also are more secure, more democratic if their economies thrive. And their economies thrive by being competitive. And we have preached the philosophy that reducing subsidies, reducing the role of the state in the government, opening those countries to new technology and trade will help them prosper. And this is what you're seeing happen throughout the hemisphere. This was so incredibly courageous about the Mexican energy reform. And this was our philosophy. And the idea is that pure U.S. interests, if you are worried about migration, creating jobs in Mexico is the most efficient way to reduce migration pressure in Mexico. If you're worried about, narco trafficking or you're worried about other issues, increasing prosperity is the best way to empower that government to deal with its issues. And so now we're putting that at risk. And so rather than, I think the Monroe Doctrine is not that popular. It's not that it's our backyard or that we're responsible. But in terms of investment, there's no question we have competition now. And that China in particular is highly present in a lot of these countries. And we hope to use U.S. investment to demonstrate anti-corrupt practices in order to raise standards, in order to support democracy. These are not necessarily values that every investor has. And to the extent that we are on the decline and they are on the rise, that hurts us. And I think that's a big disadvantage. And it's this investment certainty, I think, that's really hurting us. We talked about LNG, and I think, Mary was right, you're deemed to be in the national interest for LNG exports, but you have to get Department of Energy approval, on a periodic basis if you're not a free trade agreement country. Well, it's a kind of a challenging time for the LNG industry right now. And what you want is for your buyers to be certain that we are a safe and secure source of exports. And so, adding uncertainty to Mexico is not going to help pipeline exports. And threatening Korea, similarly in a different context, is not going to help them feel confident they should be buying from us. So we need to be, competing for investment right now and creating more certainty. And I think that's a risk. Just one other point I'd want to add is the service industry of the U.S. has taken a big hit over the last few years because of the decline in oil prices. The largest, probably close by, source of new jobs for the service industry is going to be the Mexican deepwater.
No question about it.
And so, but that means trade in labor, trade in goods, and also Mexico is going to have choices. Their reform lets them determine levels of local content. And so right now, those levels are relatively low because they don't make those things. You change those levels because they want to keep that at home, or you make it difficult to have trade and labor. And then maybe it's not the U.S. service industry that gets the lion's share of that. So I think a lot of that's at risk too.
Very important points. Let's open it up to the audience now for questions.
Remind everyone our rule